Hello everyone. Today, we're going to talk about Stoicism. We share the same interest in Stoicism. It's a philosophy I've already mentioned to you several times, and in my opinion, it deserves to be promoted because it is a practical philosophy, one that doesn't require a special background in philosophy to understand, and because its teachings are relevant to everyone. There are philosophers who talk about things that don't interest many people, or at least they talk about them in terms that may not resonate with us, whereas Stoics, on the contrary, talk to us about familiar things. They talk to us about emotions, desires, disappointment, suffering. In short, all those things that punctuate our daily lives and which, for many of us, we no longer question because we've integrated them. We've integrated suffering, we've integrated disappointment and regret, we've normalized them. Based on the idea that if these things are part of our lives, then they must be part of life itself, and therefore, nothing can be changed about them. But what the Stoics tell us is that we can change something, we can even radically change things, but it starts with becoming aware of them. When we operate in emotional stress, when we operate in frustration, in anger, in all these negative emotions, and we get used to them, we end up embracing them. We end up blending with them, just as we get used to gravity. When you walk, you don't think about the fact that you're moving within gravity. But if you fall from the 4th floor, you'll realize it. Well, it's the same with emotions. We get used to them, we normalize them, to the point where we don't even notice them anymore. What the Stoics tell us is that no, suffering doesn't have to be normalized. No, disappointment and regret don't have to be normalized. No negative emotion, or even any emotion at all, needs to be normalized. Because we can free ourselves from our emotions. Now, I should clarify that the Stoics didn't use the word emotion, they talked about passion. Where in antiquity, the vocabulary wasn't exactly the same. And passions? Contrary to what we might think today, it's not something positive. Passion, from the Greek, pathos, is something we undergo. Passion makes us passive, and pathos also means the suffering, the pain of the soul. So, when I say that for the Stoics, we can free ourselves from our emotions, we obviously need to take the time to explain. Because I can already hear people saying, how can we free ourselves from our emotions? But emotions can't be controlled. We observe an emotion. We witness it. We're not responsible for it. Because we're not responsible for our sensitivity. Well, this is where some explanations are needed. For the Stoics, we are responsible for our emotions because our emotions are the product of judgment. Judgment of the world, judgment of others, and judgment of ourselves. In short, for the Stoic, freeing oneself from emotions and the resulting suffering involves freeing oneself from judgment. Let's start with a quote from Epictetus. Let me remind you that Epictetus was a Stoic who had the particularity of being a slave. In fact, the name Epictetus means servant in Greek. Epictetus said, "What troubles men is not things, but the judgments they make about things." This seemingly simple statement sums it all up. Now, let's try to understand why he says this. Saying that what troubles us is not things, but the judgments we make about things, is to say that things might not affect us, but that we allow them to affect us. In other words, we let things affect us because we impose judgments on them, and it is these judgments that are the real cause of our suffering. Let's take a concrete example. Imagine that a friend betrays you. You can imagine any type of scenario. He talks behind your back, he steals your money, he flirts with your fiancé, whatever you want to imagine. Now, imagine you find out that this friend has betrayed you. At that moment, what are you going to feel? Well, if you're like most people, you're going to be angry at him. You'll feel anger, maybe even rage, hatred. This anger will come not only from the harm he has caused you but also from the disappointment. A friend is someone you trust, someone you have expectations of. By definition, you can only be betrayed by someone you have invested your trust in. And this anger will gnaw at you. This anger will consume you from the inside. You will suffer. You'll clench your teeth, clench your fists. And if you let your anger take over, you might knock on his door and make him understand in no uncertain terms that it was a mistake to do that to you. In any case, the result of this betrayal will be an emotional reaction. At that moment, if someone comes to you and says, "Well, you know, you're suffering, but it's not really your friend's fault," it's not the betrayal that makes you suffer. It's the judgment you make about it. The only person responsible for your anger is yourself. Well, then you might say, "Are you kidding me? Of course, it's his fault. Of course, it's his betrayal that makes me suffer. I didn't do anything wrong." But actually, you did. For the Stoics, you are responsible for your suffering. Because you expected your friend to behave in a way that you were not in control of. If your friend betrayed you, it's not your fault. That choice wasn't within your control. It's his choice. But being affected by what doesn't depend on us is condemning ourselves to unhappiness. Let's take another example to make things clearer. Imagine you're playing the lottery. You play the lottery thinking, "Well, you never know. With a bit of luck, I might become a millionaire." So you play, the draw takes place, and you lose. At that moment, what are you going to feel? A little disappointment. That's normal. No one plays to lose. But in reality, this disappointment won't affect you for very long or very intensely. Because deep down, you knew that your chances of winning were slim. You weren't betting your future on it. If you had won, you would have been extremely happy. But if you lose, it's not a big deal. Why? Because you knew from the start that your chances of winning were low. So your reaction will match the probability you had of winning. Low probability of winning equals low expectation equals low disappointment. So in reality, it's the expectation that generates disappointment. If your expectation is low, your disappointment will also be low. If your expectation is high, your disappointment will be just as great. Now, let's go back to the case of your friend who betrayed you. What affects you is not that your friend betrayed you, it's that you didn't expect him to betray you. You had an expectation of loyalty from him, an expectation of fidelity in the original sense of the word, faith. And so when you learn that this expectation isn't met, you suffer. So it's the expectation you had of him that is the cause of your suffering. An enemy, it's not surprising if he betrays us. It's even the least you can expect. The problem of betrayal only arises with people we trust. It's always our close ones who betray us. By extension, it's always our close ones who hurt us the most. Because we place expectations on them. And these expectations are what come back to haunt us when they're not fulfilled by the person we trust. So, the problem doesn't lie with the person but with our expectations of the person. Betrayal only hurts us because we judge it as something unacceptable for a friend to betray us. Now, what do the Stoics tell us? They tell us that we are responsible for the expectation we placed in our friend. We trusted him, we literally believed in his loyalty, but that belief was our own. I remind you that the etymology of trust is fidelity, faith. Trust is always a matter of faith. Why do we trust? Because we feel we can trust. So yes, there are cases where the person has proven that we can trust them. That we can, not that we must. Because you never know if you were right to trust someone until that person betrays that trust. You never know. So every expectation is based on a projection. On a projection that doesn't belong to us to control. Does this mean we should no longer trust anyone? No. It means that if you trust someone, you should expect that person to betray your trust. Because it happens. Because it's part of the order of things. Because humans are not perfect. They sometimes betray. They sometimes make mistakes. And there's nothing you can do about it. Believing that the person you trust will never betray you, that's the mistake. Because it's assuming that humans could be infallible. But you know very well that humans are not infallible. So why expect humans to behave in a way that no human can? Isn't that where the mistake lies? Isn't the mistake in having unattainable expectations? Isn't the mistake in not understanding what reality is? Of course, in the face of this discourse, idealistic and moralizing discourses will rise. But how can one say that? Trust is fundamental. Should we then accept everything, tolerate everything? Is that the Stoic model? No, that's not the Stoic model. The Stoic model is to say that we are never right against reality. The reality is that betrayal exists. The reality is that humans are driven by forces that are not always moral forces. Humans are driven by ego, by the desire for power, by self-interest. And no matter how much we sing serenades in praise of virtue, that won't make humans more virtuous. Humans are what they are, they have their qualities and their faults, and by projecting moral and ideal expectations onto them, we condemn ourselves to disappointment. We condemn ourselves to unhappiness. Marcus Aurelius said, "From dawn, say to yourself in advance, I will meet an indiscreet person, an ingrate, an insolent person, a deceitful person, an envious person, a selfish person." Why did Marcus Aurelius say this? Because he believed that all humans were immoral? No. Because he believed these things existed. Not that they were systematic. Not that there were no virtues among humans. But because humans are not solely made up of virtues. That's the nuance. When we have expectations of someone, we project onto them an ideal. An ideal that, when we know a bit about human nature, we know is unattainable. But the whole problem lies in the when we know human nature. Not when we idealize human nature. Not when we fantasize. The great lesson of Stoicism is the lesson of realism. Realism that makes us understand and accept that we cannot expect from humans what they are not capable of achieving. Realism that should encourage us to be cautious, to be prudent. To understand and accept that if we expect from humans what they cannot achieve, we will suffer. And it won't help to blame others. Because first, it won't change the situation, and second, it will only trap us in denial. Our problem wasn't that humans behave like humans, with their flaws, their weaknesses, and their vices. Our problem is that we expect humans to behave as if they weren't human. As if they weren't subject to flaws, weaknesses, and vices. That's where the problem lies. The problem comes from our expectations. The problem comes from our judgment and our desire for human nature to conform to our judgment when it should be the opposite. It is not human nature that should conform to our judgment about human nature. It is our judgment that should conform to what human nature is. That's the key. Accept humans as they are to avoid being disappointed by them. Accept humans as they are to avoid having unattainable expectations. And you can say whatever you want, you can curse human nature, say that people are mean or disappointing. It won't change anything. The only question is, are you willing to change your expectations of humans? Are you willing to admit that your expectations of humans don't come from observing human nature but from an ideal you project onto it? That's the real question. The rest is just chatter. The rest is just an excuse not to have to change your judgment about what human nature should be. And that's why you're responsible for your emotions. You're responsible for your emotions because your emotions depend not on the reality of human nature but on the judgment of what human nature should be. The problem is not reality, it's the judgment of reality. When Marcus Aurelius lists human flaws, it's not to say that all humans are necessarily bad or hostile. It's to say that we should expect to find these flaws in humans because these flaws are part of human nature, and expecting humans not to be human is insane. It's insane, and it's because it's insane that it makes us unhappy. What makes us unhappy are not the things themselves. It's not the things as they are. It's the gap between things as they are and things as we want them to be, as we imagine them, as we idealize them, as we judge them. That's where the problem lies, in our judgment. The whole problem comes from our judgment of things. The Stoics say, there are things that depend on us, and there are things that don't depend on us. Being affected by what doesn't depend on us is insane. Because it's believing that what doesn't depend on us could depend on us. It's believing that we could have an influence on what doesn't depend on us. It's irrational. The Stoics advocate reason. They advocate conformity to the logos, the logical laws on which the laws of nature are based. If it rains, you're not going to cry. You're going to take an umbrella. If it's cold, you're not going to cry. You're going to cover yourself. In other words, when faced with a situation, you're going to adapt. Because you know that you can't ask the sky to be sunny or warm. You know that doesn't depend on you. What depends on you is to protect yourself from the elements. To make sure that the effects of reality on you are cushioned. So why should it be any different with humans? Why should humans conform to your expectations, to what you hope from them? It doesn't work that way. And you know it. So, if you know it, why continue to live and act as if you didn't know it? Why continue to be disappointed by someone who doesn't conform to your vision of what they should be? Have you forgotten that human beings are driven by their own motivations? Have you forgotten that people don't wait to know what you think of them before doing what they believe they need to do? Who do you think you are? That's really the question Stoics are asking you. Who do you think you are to believe that reality will adapt to you? It's up to you to adapt to reality. And if you don't, you can only blame yourself. If you're unhappy because you didn't take reality as it is into account, the fault doesn't lie with reality. The fault lies with you. Reality is what it is. That's its job. Your job is to understand that reality and adapt to it. To accept it. Not to project onto it what you wish it were. Not to burden it with your own expectations. So the choice is simple: acceptance or unhappiness. Accept what doesn't depend on us so as not to be unhappy. So as not to make our happiness dependent on what doesn't depend on us. We are used to judgment. We are used to saying what is right and what is wrong. To saying what others should or shouldn't do. Moreover, we are much quicker to point out what's wrong with others than to recognize what's wrong with ourselves. Because we see the world through our own perception frameworks. Because we see the world through the prism of our own consciousness. Starting from that, anything that doesn't match our own way of functioning will be dismissed. Otherness eludes us, even among those who claim to be open and tolerant. It's not true that we are open and tolerant. We are sectarian, fundamentally sectarian. As soon as something displeases us, we rush to judge it, not to understand it, not to try to understand it, but to judge it. It shouldn't be done this way, it should be done that way. And every time we judge what displeases us, it's as if we're inflicting a cut on our model of representation. We get angry, indignant, outraged. And by doing so, we make ourselves suffer. Instead of simply saying to ourselves, that's how it is, and if it is that way, there must be a reason. People are what they are. They act as they act, they think as they think, and it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal as long as we don't try to impose our judgments on others. Of course, there are times when we know we're right, and the other person doesn't want to hear it. Times when we know the other person is wrong and doesn't realize it because their sensitivity or experience hasn't provided them with the keys to understanding. But we know. And because we know, we want to make it known. We want to let the other person know that we know better than they do. And if they don't listen, it bothers us. Again, it's not so much what the other person does that bothers us. It's the judgment we make of it. A friend being exploited at work who doesn't realize it, we want to say to them, wake up, revolt. A friend who is unhappy in their relationship, and we know they should end it because we can see it's going nowhere. Wake up, revolt. But it's pointless. It's always after the fact that advice resonates with us when we have understood. You can judge your friend's situation as you see fit. You can advise them on whatever you want. The question is, how much does the judgment you pass on your friend affect you? How much does not being listened to, not being heard, make you suffer? That's the real question. Your suffering. The suffering that comes from your judgment. Let's take another example. You're walking down the street. You slip on a cobblestone and fall. Fortunately, you're not injured. But everyone saw you. Everyone saw you flat on your back. At that moment, what will you feel? Shame. Or at least, embarrassment. Your suffering isn't so much physical as it is moral. Your dignity got hurt. And why did your dignity get hurt? Because other people's judgment of you affects you. Because you think, I look stupid. And appearance is very important. It's in a world of hypocrisy that we pretend that the opinions of others don't affect us. Of course, they affect us. Of course, we want to present the best image of ourselves to others. Denying it is denying reality. The reality of the ego that wants to govern our self-image. The moral of this story is that just as judgment affects us more than events, it is the judgment of others that affects us more than the actual situation we experience in front of them. Because we project ourselves into their consciousness, we think in their place, and we imagine what they must be thinking. And what they think is very important. Remember when you were in middle school and had to stand in front of the whole class to give a presentation? In that situation, many of you were in a panic because you were thinking, what will they think of me? What will the others say? The emotional stress we feel when we think we're being watched, when we think we're being scrutinized, is the stress of judgment. Of a judgment that is not so much the real judgment of those who watch us as the judgment we project onto those who watch us. That's the irony of judgment. It affects us even when it doesn't exist. It affects us as long as we make it exist. The problem with judgment is us. What people think, concretely, what difference does it make? What difference does it make besides what we allow it to change? Why can judgments, that is, immaterial things, things that have no direct hold on us, affect us, stress us out, bother us, sadden us? Because we make them exist. While as soon as we rationalize, as soon as we truly put ourselves in the place of the other on whom we impose imaginary judgments, we realize that all this is pure projection. When you gave your presentation, most of the students were thinking about something else. About what they did the day before or what they were going to do after class. No one cares. No one cares about you. The greatest amount of judgment on you that has ever accumulated is your own. It's your judgment on yourself that has poisoned your existence the most, not that of others. And you know it. So the question is, why continue to give value to the judgment of others? Why continue to give importance to something that only impacts you to the extent that you allow it to? That's the real question. So, for the Stoics, our emotional suffering, stress, shame, worry, all of that, we're responsible for it. It's in our heads. Nothing can affect you emotionally unless you consent to being affected. And when you take stock, when you compare what has happened to you to your reactions to what has happened to you, you'll see at a glance which way the balance tilts. It tilts toward reaction. It tilts toward amplification through judgment. That's the reality. And it applies to everything. People don't like you. Okay? So what? What difference does it make? What difference does it make to you? Concretely. Everything lies in the concretely. Concretely means without it being a product of your mind, without it being a pure construction of your mind. And it's a crucial difference. Because it's the difference between what concerns you and what doesn't concern you. It's the difference between what affects you by the force of things and what affects you because you allowed it to affect you. The difference is you. So if we summarize, there's the judgment you pass on situations, which affects you more than the situations themselves. And there is the judgment of others, or rather, the judgment you project onto others, which affects you more than what you think they are judging you for. In both cases, what affects you is judgment. What affects you are mental projections. Mental projections that will either change nothing about the situation and will only make a situation painful that wouldn't be without your judgment, or that project onto others a judgment that is only a product of your imagination and affects you in return as a pure boomerang effect. As if we were constructing the reasons for our own mental suffering ourselves. So the Stoics' lesson is that we must embrace what happens to us. We must become one with what happens. Because judgment dissociates us. It dissociates us from reality and from ourselves. It dissociates us from this ability to receive things as they are, to accept rather than react, to live rather than judge. I quote, "Among things, some depend on us, others do not depend on us. Those that depend on us are opinion, will, desire, aversion. In a word, everything that is our own work. Those that do not depend on us are the body, possessions, reputation, dignities. In a word, everything that is not our own work. And the things that depend on us are by nature free. No one can hinder them, nothing can block them. But those that do not depend on us are powerless, enslaved, subject to hindrance, foreign to us. Remember then that if you believe free those things that are by nature enslaved, and that are your own those things that are foreign, you will be hindered, afflicted, troubled, you will accuse God and man. But if you believe yours, that alone which is yours, and foreign that which is indeed foreign, no one will ever force you to do anything, no one will prevent you. You will complain about no one, you will accuse no one, you will not involuntarily perform a single action. No one will harm you, and you will have no enemies, for you will not even be able to suffer anything harmful. So immediately, in the face of any painful imagination, practice saying, "You are imagination and appearance, not at all the object you seem to be." Then probe it and judge it with the rules you possess. The first and most important is to see whether it concerns the things that depend on us or those that do not depend on us. If it concerns the latter, be ready to say, "There is nothing there that concerns me." Remember that what one promises in desire is to obtain the desired object. What one promises in aversion is to avoid the object of aversion. And he who is frustrated in his desire is unhappy. He who falls into what he avoids is miserable. So avoid only the things that, depending on you, are contrary to nature, and you will not fall into what you avoid. But if you want to avoid illness, or death, or poverty, you will be miserable. Therefore, turn your aversion away from all things that do not depend on us and direct it towards things that, depending on us, are contrary to nature. As for desire, suppress it entirely for now. For if you desire any of those things that do not depend on us, you will necessarily be unhappy. And on the other hand, among the things that depend on us and that it would be good to desire, none are yet present for you. So confine yourself to approaching or distancing yourself from things by a voluntary, but not very energetic, movement, with reservations and in moderation. What troubles men is not things but the judgments they make about things. For example, death is nothing terrible, for Socrates too would have found it terrible. But our opinion on death, which makes us see it as terrible, is what is terrible. So when we are hindered, or troubled, or afflicted, never accuse others, but ourselves, that is, our opinions, the work of an ignorant man to accuse others of his own evils. The man who begins to learn accuses himself. The educated man accuses neither others nor himself. Do not boast of any foreign advantage. If a horse boasted, saying, "I am beautiful," it would be tolerable. But you, when you proudly say, "I have a beautiful horse," know that you are boasting about the qualities of a horse. What, then, is yours? The use you make of your representations. So when you use these representations in accordance with nature, only then be proud, for you will be proud of a good that is yours. Do not expect things to happen as you wish. Decide to want what happens, and you will be happy. Stoics are often perceived as inhuman philosophers, as philosophers who denied our emotional dimension, who would encourage us to cut ourselves off from all feelings, from all emotional ties with humans. Death should not affect you because it is an inevitable and natural thing. Betrayal should not affect you because it is an inevitable and natural thing. Shame and regret should not affect you because these are inevitable and natural things. But then, what should affect us? For the Stoic, only what depends on us should affect us. Not before, not after, but during. Act when we must act with all our attention, with all our concentration. Act in full presence, without mental projection, without fear of judgment, but with the conviction of doing what is right. Because we will take nothing to the grave, nothing but the satisfaction of having lived well. Thank you.